Well, an expectant hush settles on the crowd. Thank you very much. And thank you for being punctual and getting back. We're starting the first of the substantive sessions, the ones you've actually come to hear now. The first session of today's conference, or the second session of today's conference, deals with correspondents, commandos, and comforters. And the way we're going to work it is that the three speakers will have 15 minutes each. And what I propose to do is not introduce them extensively individually, because if you want to know more about the speakers, you can find them in the contributors' notes in the excellent book, a ploy to get you to buy them, of course. And you'll learn much more about them there than you will from me. Three presentations will be in this order. First of all, Peter Holmes, you can start moving, Peter. Peter Holmes, who's going to talk about war correspondence. Carl James will talk about commandos and the SOE, and then Megan Adams talking about VADs, the ARC and the ACF. And all I'll say about Peter is that he and I worked together 40 years ago at the Australian War Memorial, and in the meantime he's done all sorts of things, as you just heard, including writing a couple of books. So, Peter, you've got 15 minutes.
Very nice to catch up after so many years. Last year, I received a call from Andrew Kilsby, whom I did not know, asking whether I'd like to contribute a chapter on Australian war correspondence in the book he was putting together on Australians in Burma during World War II. Although I had written a book myself on Australian war correspondence, I was not aware of the many Australian war correspondents covering the Burma front to any large degree, apart from some very brief mentions in my earlier book. I agreed to Andrew's request, although a little hesitant given my assumption that not many Australian correspondents were in Burma. I was, of course, aware of Australian war correspondents covering fighting in the Middle East, in Greece, Malaya, Singapore, and in New Guinea, which was understandable given Australian active participation in those theatres of wars. Imagine to my surprise, therefore, to discover the significant number of Australian correspondents who did in fact cover the Burma campaign at various stages during the war. These included well-known authors and correspondents such as Wilfred Burchett, George Johnston, Frank Clune and Ronald Mackay. Not only that, however, but some Australian war correspondents were considered by many as some of the best and most daring correspondents in Burma. Some of these had a reputation of actively seeking to report from frontline positions, often circumventing navigating official restrictions to do so. The initial phase of the Burma campaign lasted from January to May 1942, which encompassed the longest retreat in British military history of almost 1,000 miles from Rangoon to the Indian border. The retreat also involved the movement of around 500,000 refugees, with many perishing along the way. When Singapore fell in February 1942, a number of correspondents had escaped from Singapore and went on to cover the Burma campaign. These included the South African correspondent O'Dowd Gallagher, who in fact had been on board HMS Repulse when it had been sunk by Japanese aircraft off Singapore. In all, some 26 correspondents covered this phase of the Burma campaign, of which 13 were British, 6 Americans and 6 were Australians. The Australians included Thomas Healy, William Mundy, Wilfred Burchett, Harry Standish, Douglas Wilkie and Roderick MacDonald. It must be remembered that the Malaya-Singapore campaign had concluded in mid-1942 and the New Guinea campaign had not really begun in earnest until July-August 1942. How Australian correspondents came to be in Burma varied. Some, such as Wilfred Burchett and Roderick MacDonald, had been in China when the Japanese attacked Pearl Harbor and travelled to cover the war in Burma in early 1942. Others included Douglas Wilkie, Ian Fitchett and Roderick MacDonald were reporting from Malaya and Singapore and managed to escape from Singapore before it was captured. Wilkie reported from Batavia before relocating to Colombo and into India and later Burma. Fitchett escaped to Batavia before returning to Australia. He later went to London before travelling and returning to India and Burma in late 1943 where he remained until 1945. Harry Standish was in Thailand when Pearl Harbor was attacked and just managed to escape from northern Thailand to Burma before the border was closed. It was even reported that he and another correspondent, Daniel Berrigan, representing the United Press, had been captured by the Japanese. He travelled some 1,200 miles to Rangoon via the Burmese Shan states, and it was weeks before news of their escape was known. He then reported from India and Burma until late 43. Thomas Healy, and we'll hear more about him shortly, was in London in September 1940, where his flat was bombed. He was badly injured and his partner Ian had been killed. He was badly wounded, but upon his recovery was sent to Singapore before he fell, and just managed to get to Rangoon via a flight from Calcutta to Lascaux, and instead of taking a train from Lascaux to Rangoon, he made the very difficult 120-mile journey by taxi to Mandalay. And he was accompanied by another correspondent, Eve Curie, who was the daughter of the famous scientist Madame Curie. His sense of adventure was clearly evident. Frank Lew, Ronald Mackay, Douglas Garner, George Johnson all reported at various times during the latter part of the campaign. The Australian correspondents reported for a variety of Australian and British newspapers, and their reports were often syndicated to a number of papers in Australia and the UK. And Peter, I'd like to echo what you said about the number of reports on the Burma campaign. It was staggering. When you read it, we've got a lot of coverage both in Australia and the UK. Healy and Monday made their presence felt in a very significant way at the beginning of the campaign. They teamed up and worked closely together to cover the British retreat, and were very keen to reach frontline positions. They witnessed the panic in Rangoon as the Japanese attacked, but were determined to reach frontline positions, often to the chagrin of other correspondents, some of whom preferred to be further away from the field. Healy was critical of some of these correspondents who based their reports from army communiques nowhere near the front. He later observed that for some correspondents, too often their conception of a war correspondent was to sit near army headquarters, hundreds of miles from the front, and rewrite the information handed out by the army. They eventually reached the front line near Pegu, 55 miles northeast from Rangoon. They even rode in tanks while attacking Japanese positions and were fired upon and dive bombed. They assisted in caring for the wounded, and they even witnessed the execution of Burmese spies who had their throats cut, who had cut the throats of a number of soldiers. Healy was nervous that the Japanese would cut his throat if he was captured. Healy's and Mundy's reporting for the fighting around Pegu was considered by some to be some of the best reporting from the war. Another correspondent who was no stranger to dangerous situations and was there from the beginning of the campaign was Wilfred Burchett. No matter what one thinks of Burchett's later activities in Korea and Vietnam, there is no doubt he was an incredibly brave individual who travelled to frontline positions whenever he could. From travelling across the Burma Road, one of the first correspondents to do so, he reported extensively from both China and Burma, often close to fighting. Burchett was also skilled in obtaining interviews with prominent personnel, including Zhou Enlai in China and later Ord Wingate. Indeed, he was partly responsible for bringing Ord Wingate's story to the outside world, and he wrote a book about Wingate, published in 1944. When he first met and interviewed Wingate, Wingate was sitting in bed naked reading a book, and Wingate often used to give interviews while naked. On another occasion, Burchett met an unkempt and smelly Buddhist monk sitting cross-legged on the floor. This monk welcomed him, and Burchett noticed a framed certificate testifying that a Charles J. Fletcher had taken a degree in engineering from Oxford. Indeed, he learned that this monk was indeed Charles Frederick Fletcher and was indeed Oxford educated and had been a former major in the British Army and had fought with the British on the Somme in the First World War. His story was amazing, from travels into Tibet, walking through India as a monk, and living in Burma since 1926. He had only 8 items in his possession. And I just found out, I couldn't find out much about him, but in fact he refused to leave Rangoon. He was captured by the Japanese, was going to be shot as a spy, but they saved him, and he was tortured, and he died in 1950. In the retreat to India, Burchett, with fellow correspondent George Roger, walked 120 miles across the mountains from the Hukawang Valley with thousands of refugees and avoiding headhunters, tigers and leopards. He was severely wounded in a dive-bombing attack while crossing a river in northern Burma. A number of correspondents left Burma to cover other theatres of war following the end of the retreat in 1942, May 1942, including Monday and Healy, which also coincided with the onset of the monsoon. Healy covered the North African campaigns, and Monday also covered North Africa, but was killed following the Salerno landings in Italy in 1943. Several Australian correspondents remained in Burma for varying periods after 42, May 42, while others arrived to cover later aspects of the campaign. Roderick MacDonald relocated to North Africa in late 1942, and in fact landed with American glider troops in Sicily and was sadly killed near Cassino in Italy in 43. Burchett left in 43 to cover the Pacific Theatre. A common problem experienced by all correspondents was that of censorship. Correspondents handled this in different ways. Douglas Wilkie was so incensed, he packed his bags and returned home at the end of 1942. After travelling 1,200 miles, he had filed a number of reports, of which 3 were banned and others heavily censored. And an article later appeared in the UK newspaper World, highlighting the issue of censorship in Burma. Wilfred Burchett managed to avoid censorship, having some of his reports sent from China instead of Burma. Douglas Gardner, who had been a correspondent on Guadalcanal, wrote an article in the Sydney Morning Herald in 1944 saying Burma had the worst censorship of any place in the British Empire. Thomas Healy and William Munday had some success directly in approaching the newly appointed head of the British Army in Burma, General Harold Alexander. Alexander was very impressed with their reporting and immediately approved them for publication. The only stipulation he made was that the Cameronians were to be referred to the famous Scottish regiment. They received much praise for their reporting, and indeed, Army intelligence relied on their reports to know what had taken place. Ian Fitchett avoided the censor when he returned to Australia and sent reports through normal telegraphic channels. He criticised the placing of Australian forces in Sumatra and Java when he thought they were lost, and he was very heavily criticised for that. On occasions, correspondents relied on the cooperation from friendly liaison and public relation officers, such as the Australian Wing Commander Kenneth Wallace Cragg, who had once worked with the Melbourne Herald. He's an amazing sort of character with an amazing background, and he was more sympathetic to the plight of correspondents than some others.
2 minutes.
Sorry?
2 minutes.
No. Oh, yeah. Okay. Okay. In later operations, Frank Clune, Ian Fitchett, Ron Mackay, George Johnson all filed reports around the fighting in Michina. Some correspondents became radicalised, such as Wilfred Burchett, by their experience or suffered psychological damage due to their experiences. Some, such as O'Dowd Gallagher, Leif Curie, later joined fighting units. Overall, I was surprised to find the number of correspondent reports appearing in Australian newspapers. There were, of course, other highly regarded correspondents covering Burma, such as the cameraman Jack Belden, Daniel Berrigan, George Roger, O'Dowd Gallagher, and Leland Stowe and others. And it would be wrong to conclude Australians were the only ones. Despite this small number, however, the Australian correspondents made a significant contribution to the public's knowledge and understanding of the Burma War. In his book, Managing the Media in the India-Burma War, Philip Woods noted that Australian correspondents were thought of some of the best in the business. They were some of the most dynamic reporters during the war.
Thanks, Peter, and admirably kept to time, a model for the rest of us.